Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. A little over 8 years ago, I left a big stable company to go to a 5-person startup. My salary doubled and my confidence tanked. I walked into the shared office and I thought, maybe I shouldn't have joined this company. It was an awful feeling. I walked in, I met the 3 other people I'd be working with. The CTO handed me a laptop. I sat between him and the CEO to get onboarded. That day, I wrote my first unit test and I got my first assignment. Non-stop working from day one. Overall, it was a great experience and it was pivotal to my career. It was also the most stressful and deflating 9 months of my life as a developer. I even spoke about it on the Develop Yourself podcast and my experience being the worst coder on the team, which is not hyperbole. It was very clear and evident that I was the worst person on this team. In the 8 years since then, I've worked for Fortune 100 companies, mid-sized startups, and a couple companies you may have even heard of. I've also spoken with around 600 of you out there at different stages of your careers, from the person in Nigeria who just learned how to code to the super senior at Amazon in Canada, and I've learned that most of our experiences are common. We're not as unique as we think, despite geographical location, language and tech stacks, education, and other things that you may think, I have nothing in common with that person. It's kind of crazy. We're all really building the same stuff. It's really wild, actually. Doing these calls has been eye-opening, to say the least. So my big takeaway from working at all these places and speaking with so many of you is this: go small for wide experience, go big for expertise and delayed financial gratification. I'm going to dig into that, and we're going to go over the pros and cons of working at different levels of companies, from the startup to the mid-sized company to the big fat Fortune 100, and why or why not you might want to join these places. New coders in general are obsessed with going to Google, Meta, Amazon, Netflix, probably because those are the companies that you've heard of, that you're familiar with, that you interact with in your personal life. These also make up a solid 0.6% of software engineering roles globally. They make up 99% of all the articles you read about life as a software engineer online. Remember all those TikToks and Instagrams of people doing the day in the life where they basically go to work and just drink coffee all day or just play a game or something like that? That was pretty cool to watch. I used to watch those too and think, man, my life is nothing like that at all. And neither is that for the majority of developers out there. Reality as a developer is a lot different than what social media shows you. In some ways, it's better and more gratifying, because imagine if your day was just drinking coffee, kind of twiddling your thumbs, walking around some beautiful campus, and then going home. Maybe that actually sounds like heaven to you. I don't know. Sounds kind of boring to me, honestly. I mean, what do you do with the other, 12 hours of your day? Commute, hang around the campus, and just eat snacks and stuff like that? Lame. Let's explore the pros and cons of working at a small startup versus the Fortune 100 versus the mid-sized company, and finally, the path I'd take if I could do it all over again. Before we get into all that, I got to let you know, there is one spot left to join Parsity, and it may be gone by the time you hear this. But if you're interested in joining, go to parsity.io/apply, PARSITY.io. Apply to work with me and our team of software developers and make 2025 the year where you work for a small startup or a big company or somewhere in between. Back to the story. Let's start off with the small startup. Big pros. You will have major impact if you do it right. The feature you write and launch could be the reason investors give your CEO enough money to make the next round of paychecks. And I'm not being facetious or exaggerating here. Sometimes the startup is that much of a startup that your paycheck might not come on time. This is not fun. This is not for the faint of heart. This is not for stability, by the way. And we'll get into the cons in just a minute. But one of the reasons you go to a small startup is because you can grow super fast. If you get in early enough, you're basically at the top of the company. If they grow, you should be one of the most knowledgeable people there because you've been there since day one. But in order to do this, you have to spread your wings a little bit. You can't just be in your little code hole, writing code all day long. This is the kind of place where in order to make impact, you got to understand a bit of the business. You can grow tremendously at these kinds of places if you do it right. Wearing a lot of hats means you could work on the deployment process, the front end, the back end, sales. You get a bird's eye view of the business and you're really close typically to the CEO, the CTO, and other executives in the business, which are basically just glorified like engineers a lot of the times. A lot of times your CTO, in quotes, is just some dude that's writing more code than you, or the guy that basically built the app, or the woman that built the app, or whatever. So you're sitting next to this person, getting in good with them, and you stick around for 5 years on the 10% chance that they actually make it, could mean a huge payday for you. I have met more than a few people in the Bay Area specifically that have gotten the 100K payouts, the $500,000 payouts, hundreds of thousands of dollars in payouts. I've also met way more that have gotten nothing. But imagine that. You spin the wheel essentially and say, I'm going to take a bit of a chance here, a huge risk for a huge reward. And an example of how you might be wearing many hats, there was one startup where I worked where I wrote code and I even did sales calls. Now here's the cons, which you probably can already guess. High risk, high reward. That feature that you launched that saved your paycheck, it could also fail long term. Here's the reality. Most startups will fail. They just will. That's part of the gamble. Your work-life balance is essentially gone. Everything is on fire or there's nothing to do. So you might go into work and you have a feature that's critical to get launched because investors want to see this feature that gets out. They say the button on this page has to be this shade of green and we have to implement this new feature by Tuesday. And so you spend all week doing it, whatever, some trivial example I'm giving you here. But then it's launched and then investors might say, cool, now we need to focus on sales. And engineering efforts may be stopped at that point. They might say, okay, guys, we got to focus everybody on sales. And guess what? You engineer person over there, you're going to do sales now too. Now, this is not common or even practical in many ways, but it does happen. I've actually been in a situation like this where I was doing sales at a startup where I was hired as a software engineer. That just can happen. When priorities change, and sales is more important than adding new features, you may be doing nothing or you may be learning sales. If the investors or the CEO want a new feature, it's the most important thing that you can do and it must be delivered. Forget your sleep. That's just how it can go. It shouldn't always go like that, but that's certainly how it can go, and you're likely to see some period where you're experiencing that. The culture can also be heavily skewed towards the personality of the loudest person in the room. This is one of those things that I didn't take seriously enough. If you got less than 20 people in a company, it can be terrible unless the person who's the loudest in the room is a well-adjusted, self-aware adult. And according to the comments on my Instagram and things I read on LinkedIn, I suspect this is less than 20% of the adult population. So this is the part where you have to be careful. Who are your coworkers? When you walk in there and you meet these people, can you see yourself working with them? Do they seem likable? That is a really important one. Do they seem at all likable? Because if they are not, it is going to be very difficult for you to go through these periods of stress and endure these people while you're also trying to work at a breakneck pace. And the cool thing about working at the startup is you've learned how to work fast. You've learned how to pump features out, get them out the door. You've learned a lot about the software development lifecycle, but you've probably picked up some pretty bad habits. You might not be producing quality code, which leads me to the mid-sized company. So this is how a real business works. There's an HR department. There's a career ladder. There's maybe even some documentation. Speed is still important, but quality checks are finally in place. There's probably a team of quality assurance engineers or QA testers, quality assurance, QA, who will verify that your code actually works. There's at least some testing infrastructure. There are processes in place that are often missing at startups or have to be made. And a lot of times at startups, people have been jaded from working in big enterprise architecture. They've come from really large companies and they either bring in those processes or they hated them so much that they say, we're going to do things all my way. We're going to reinvent the wheel, only to find out that they end up making a version of that same process, which they just left. But that's a whole other story right there. So if startups have an absence of processes, Mid-sized companies finally have those processes in place, and these are great to learn because this is the way that most companies will work on some level. Startups are not really representative of the way that most other companies work. I mean, if you're working with 5, 10 people, or 20, or even 30 or 40 or 50, there's nowhere near the scale of a company that has 10,000 people or even a few hundred people. And if it's been around for less than a year, they definitely haven't been bitten by some of the decisions they've made yet. And the mid-sized company has already learned these things and gone through it, and they've been doing this for a while. So they kind of got things in order, right? So there's some semblance of organization right here. Here's the other good thing. You can learn from more than one or two people. At the startup I was at in the beginning of my story here, I could only learn from like one other dude on the team. That was it. It was me and him. And then we finally onboarded one more guy who left kind of shortly afterwards. But I didn't really get a diversity of experience. Now, luckily, the people I worked with were top notch. But if you work at a mid-sized company, you just get more people. So you have Sally, who's on DevOps. You have Joey, who's in, software engineering. You have Tim, who's doing back-end stuff. And you can walk around and meet these people and ask them what they're doing and work with them and get more experience and a different perspective on things. Now, stability is still a myth, right? But there should be more stability here. I always say stability is a myth because I think people want stability so much. I know I get it. We're humans. We crave stability. You want a guarantee from me at Parsity that you can get a job. You want a guarantee from the big company that they won't let you go and you won't be fired if you're loyal and stay there. If the company's big enough, you make that assumption that, I'm going to be safe here. That does not exist. It never has, and it never will. Not in our lifetime, at least. I don't believe so. Oddly enough, on a complete tangent, I looked this up. I thought, are companies actually less stable than they used to be like 40 years ago? It turns out the opposite is true. Companies are actually more quote unquote stable now than they were like in the 1980s, which was mind blowing to me. And how did I look this up? I looked for the average tenure of an employee from like 1980s and 90s versus the 2010s and 2020s. And apparently in the 80s and 90s, there was a shorter tenure for employees. Now, the reason I think that we now look at the current job market as being more unstable is one, because we have a younger workforce. This is the first time they've gone through any kind of economic uncertainty besides in like 2008. Also, we have social media where it's an echo chamber of the worst and the best experiences. Anyways, that's a whole other tangent in itself. But reality is stability has never been a thing that you can expect at any job, and certainly not at a mid-sized company, a startup, or a big company. But there should be more stability at the mid-sized company. Like, at least you can know when your check is coming, right? You can expect that at the very least. So here's the cons. You think, this is how a business works. You get that corporate culture creep, right? Like, let's have a meeting to prepare for another meeting. And then let's have a meeting to discuss that meeting. And all these stupid red tape and ceremonies that people need to do that have zero impact or benefit for you, that have just kind of crept into the office culture, right? You get kind of that office culture that no one really likes, right? You get the we're a family type of vibe sometimes, if it's a really bad company at least. And that can be, draining, not fun, just kind of soul sucking a little bit, right? You can't touch everything either. If you were at the startup, they let you touch everything. You wanted access to the database? Boom, you got it. You wanted to see what the sales guy was doing? Boom, you got it. You want to see what Sally, who's the CEO, is working on? You can just go to her desk and ask her because she's just sitting right across from you, or she's just on Slack. She's the fifth person that's on Slack, right? And you could talk to the CEO and the CTO and everybody else, and they would give you access to everything. Now, you might think it's a good thing now that you can't touch everything, and I would partially agree, but this also kind of silos you. This can be at a very, very extreme level. This could be somewhere like Facebook, where engineers make jokes about working on a button for years, or people at Google that I've met that joke, I was working on this input box for the last 5 years. And they get so granular with the stuff that they look at that can be kind of boring and maybe even not prepare you greatly for the future once you leave the company. So no, you can't have admin access to the database. No, you can't directly push your code to production. No, you can't see the CEO out of nowhere. You can't just walk into the big executive's office. Here's another one of the cons. The career ladder is in place, but it's often a tiny one if it's a mid-sized company. The CTO might be a few levels up from you, which means the highest that you can really go is senior developer. If you're a senior, then the jump into management or beyond might depend on either A, massive growth, aka more funding or more revenue, or B, someone just quitting. That means you may be locked into your position for quite a while. So that leads us to the big leagues. Welcome to the big leagues, bucko. Now, I did this jump. I went to Clorox, which is a huge company, which you probably know for making bleach. They're a Fortune 100 company. They make billions of dollars, and it was quite an experience going there, and I learned a lot about corporate tech. This is a non-tech company, but I was doing a lot of tech stuff. I was working on their website and working on their e-commerce stack with a group of engineers. This is a really fun experience, and I got to finally see what it was like to be in a big, fat organization. Number one, stocks actually mean something, and it can actually increase your pay by quite a lot. You ever hear about those engineers that you see online that say, I made $650,000 working at Meta, and you think, how? How is that possible? Who is paying over $500,000 for you to write code? Well, it does happen, but what they're not telling you exactly is that that's not their base salary. Your base salary is what comes in your paycheck, and it's rare for that to ever get over $200,000, $250,000, $300,000, which is still what I consider kind of like FU money, right? Especially if you don't live on the coast of the United States. That is what you could consider rich, damn near. Now, the way you go from $300,000 or even $180,000 to $600,000 is through stocks and bonuses. So at a startup, these mean zero. In fact, at most startups and mid-sized companies, your bonus will be like just pennies, right? It might be maybe 5, 10%. At the startup, 0%. You're not getting a bonus. It's just not going to happen. You're probably not even going to get a pay raise after a year or two. It's just not guaranteed the way it is at a mid-sized company. Now, at a big company, that pay raise can be 10%, 20% if you jump levels because of the career ladder. Like the career ladder is usually really long. It's very clear in how to navigate it. There's usually openings because people are leaving and there's hundreds of people. So it's not crazy to make a series of jumps over a few years. I did this exactly when I got to Clorox. I went from senior to staff to engineering manager to senior engineering manager through a series of lucky, fortunate events and just kind of grinding and being in the right place at the right time. I also saw my stocks and my salary increase tremendously over this time. I think I made an additional $100,000 over that time, which is a wild amount to make extra. I think it was actually $90,000 exactly more than what I made than when I came in. I came in at $160,000, and I think I left at $250,000 at the time when I left, which was really cool. And that was partially including stocks. But the stocks mean something when you get to these big companies because they make a lot of money. They have tried and true processes, meaning that there should be less error-prone software. This is not always the case at all. And I can already see people rolling their eyes thinking, well, I work at a big company and all we do is push out bugs. Yeah, but at a startup or the mid-sized company, this just tends to happen more, and the blowups are like not as big of a deal. If you push out code to production that really no one has verified at a big company, it could be devastating. It could cost them money. It could be a legal issue. Look at some of the big high-profile blowups we've seen lately with CrowdStrike or with Microsoft and the big Windows update. Now, these are the kinds of mistakes that cost the world billions of dollars. These are really huge issues. That's why things tend to move really slow at these places, which gets me into the cons. But before, there's one big thing about working at these companies beyond the money, beyond all the junk, right? Beyond, money is important, but it's not everything. Here's actually a really important thing. It has nothing to do with money at all. That little badge that you get on LinkedIn, it just bought you years and years and years of validation. Because when the company has clout, so do you. So if the company is big and famous enough, in the tech sector especially, you basically get a magic pass for interviews for similar companies. I kind of experienced this, but I kind of got the short end of the stick with this one because Clorox is not a tech company. So I was actually told specifically by a tech forward company that they weren't really moving forward with me because they thought, well, you worked at Clorox, that was like ecom. They kind of just looked at me like, well, you're not really part of the cool kid tech club, was essentially the vibe I got there. And that was a little silly on their part. And I don't know what to say to that, but it is a thing. I have that badge on my LinkedIn. It's going to be there for a while, maybe forever, right? People look at it and they either are impressed or they think, well, what the hell do you know about writing code? What were you doing at a bleach company for 4 years? Well, what could you possibly have done there? And, that's a little bit naive thinking, but it's the reality. So the cons: office politics. These become serious and high stakes at this level. Learning how to look good in front of people, do good presentations, take on high visibility projects. These are the key to your promotions. Not whether you delivered this feature on time or how smart you are, the sexy code you wrote. These might help you more at the mid-size and startup level, but especially when you get further into these larger companies, these really don't count for much. There's too many people to keep track of, and your boss's boss doesn't really even write code or know what that is exactly. So you got to find a different way to get on their radar, and it's not going to be from writing lots and lots of code. And things are slow, right? The company's 5 years away from using the technology that you use at the startup that you just left. There's paperwork and approvals needed for that library you want to use, and that library could be React.js, right? Like crazy stuff you just take for granted. Like, oh, of course I can have that. No, you can't use ChatGPT. No, you can't use this NPM package. It has to go through a security scan and get a vulnerability check from our senior architects, and that takes at least a week. And you're like, what? Seriously? This is the kind of stuff you just download on your computer and just get to work on at the midsize or the small startup. No one would care. At these big places, they care. And if you get caught just going around these processes, they might actually slap your hand or at worst, maybe even fire you. Now, stability is still a myth. Yeah, they're big, but it doesn't matter. If you're laid off from here, you're going to have a hard time settling, in quotes, for lower tier companies, especially if you let your lifestyle inflate too much. So, economic advice for you, my 2 cents on that you didn't ask for. If and when you do get that job as a developer, which I have no doubt that you will, if you haven't already, if you're looking for the next one, I guarantee you're going to be fine. Just keep at it, be consistent, and do the thing, and you'll be fine. You cannot control the outcome. You can control the inputs. When you do get that job, you get that first big old paycheck that you've been lusting after for so long. Don't go out and buy a whole bunch of junk. I knew a dude that went to a boot camp, and he got out of it. This is like 12, 13 years ago. He got a Mercedes-Benz immediately, before he even got his first paycheck. And he's doing fine still now. It's not like he fell off and was all broke now. But that was just a silly thing to do. He was still living in an apartment, having trouble paying his rent. And then he went out and bought a Mercedes-Benz because it made him feel good. I kind of get it, but I'm also like, I still go shopping at discount grocery stores for this exact reason. I understood very quickly when I was meeting people in the Bay Area that they just spent too much. I've been broke and I was driving people with money around in Lyft and Uber in the San Francisco Bay Area, which I've spoken about before. And I was shocked sometimes hearing people talk about like how little they were making, and they were making like over 100K. I was making around half that at the time, and I was still doing normal things. I had a family. We had a mortgage. I took small vacations. I wasn't like living on the streets eating beans out of a can, right? And then you'd hear about people making $160,000 saying, oh man, the Bay Area, it's so expensive. How can anybody survive on less than, $400,000 a year? Some silly number these people would make up. And I'm thinking, you just don't know how to live like a poor person. I do. And I still kind of do, to be completely honest with you. I mean, I don't think about money as much, but I would say that one of the superpowers that I have, and the one I'd encourage you to adopt, is not overspending. When you get the money that you want, don't buy too much junk. Just buy a little bit of junk. Not too much though. Maybe you're eating bad ice cream. Now you're eating really nice ice cream. Maybe you were drinking some coffee out of 7-Eleven and you upgrade to Starbucks. But, should you go blowing all your checks on Mercedes-Benzes and Whole Food shopping sprees? Maybe don't do that. Last point, skill rot is real. You're working on a legacy code base for the most part at these big companies, using some outdated language and library. And when you go back on the market, which you will, it may be difficult to sell your old skills to a fast-paced company, which is back to the point I've been trying to make throughout this podcast. Stability is a freaking myth. Now, here's the path I would choose if I could start over. And as a little context, I want to tell you that 47% of developers, according to Stack Overflow, have worked for organizations that have fewer than 100 employees. Think about that. Nearly half of the people surveyed by Stack Overflow have worked for an organization that has fewer than 100 employees. Small companies that you've never heard of. You are very likely to work for an amazing company writing quality software that nobody has ever heard of. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you. I like money. I'm not going to pretend I don't. Maybe you do too. If I was going to optimize for making large sums of money, I would do this. 1, join a small startup to learn a breadth of technologies. Go wide. Leave that startup for a mid-sized company where my goal would then be to get promoted to senior. Now, at stage 1, I would stay there for a year, maybe 2. Stage 2, maybe 2 to 3 years if possible. Stage 3, move to another mid-sized company or a mature startup, one with processes and more than 5 people, like 50 people, right? Where I would want to then try to get into leadership. Why do you want to do that? Because now you have the breadth of experience. You've worked at a variety of companies at this point. The mid-sized companies give you enough of the experience that will be relatable to the large company. And once you are near or in the leadership circle, it's a lot easier to sell yourself as a leader at the next company, which leads me to step number 4. When you're at the manager or right around that manager level, that engineering manager level, make it your goal to get to a big, boring company as a leader, because then you're going to get access to stocks, bonuses, and a chance to make a full transition into leadership and join the executive suite, where there is an enormous amount of money, influence, and power. If that's what you like. If you don't like any of those things, or you don't want to job hop strategically and go through all the other processes and practice and tasks that are involved in jumping around, like studying for, interviews and things like that, then don't do any of this stuff. Go where you want to go. I still might join a small startup at some stage in my career because I think it gives you a really, really cool insight that you won't normally get. And you could grow with them and become a really, really big fish in a big company if you play it right. And if you don't play it right, well then, hey, if you pick the right startup with the right people, using the right technology, you're going to learn a ton. And that could be really valuable to your career going forward. I nearly got to the executive suite using this formula, but I got laid off. Now I'm back at square 3. I don't know. I went back to be a senior full stack engineer after being a senior engineering manager. And also very, very quickly, I was an associate director of technology at a mortgage company. And I got that one really quickly. I realized that, hey, you know what I want to optimize for right now? Learning. Because I can go back now with my history and my titles and stuff. I can probably go back and find something pretty cool in the future. But right now, I'm way more worried about optimizing for technical skill and then potentially growing with a really small company and being at the top of it if and when they explode. So I may have moved too fast in retrospect. So your path will ultimately be your own path. I always want to encourage you to do what makes sense to you. I say things with a lot of conviction, and I say them matter-of-factly because I think it's easier to digest information that way. I think you should do what you want to do, and I always hope that's helpful. By the way, if you want to join Parsity, we got like 3 spots left. Can you believe that? 3 spots left for the last cohort of the year, and so many cool things coming up in the next year that I can't wait to finally unveil. It feels like I've been sitting on this for so long. I can't wait to share it. Anyway, have a great rest of your week and weekend, and I'll see you around. That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. To learn more about becoming a software engineer with us, then check out parsity.io. If you're not quite ready for that, then jump into our dev30.xyz program, which is 30 days of working on your mindset, habits, and JavaScript skills. Totally worth it. See you next week.